and all the rest of it, that will now continue for at least another week until Saturday, the 7th of July. That's now the earliest that Russia can exit the tournament. So with the weather set fair, expect a bumper week of World Cup fanery in Russia. Jay, you know a lot about the Russians. Great to be with you. Thank you for joining us, Jay Dyer.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm certainly no Basil Valentine, but I know a little bit.
They've been our supposed nemesis since the end of the Second World War. Then, of course, when the Berlin Wall came down and everybody was plying Boris Yeltsin with copious quantities of vodka while looting the country, they then became our best friend, of course. Everything Russian was terribly fashionable for a while in the 1990s, but recent years, of course, have seen them demonized once again, no more so over the last 6 months, with particular reference to Hollywood and its portrayal of Russians. Well, I just wondered why you think it might be, Jay, author of Esoteric Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood loves an enemy more than anything else, doesn't it? So it's got to help them really to keep the narratives, to keep the thrillers going. Do you know what I mean? What would you do?
Well, it was Bernays who said that the greatest engine of propaganda in the world was the cinema, was Hollywood, and certainly Hollywood has been chief among giving us our villains. I would argue even more powerfully so than the mainstream media. But of course, the mainstream media in Hollywood, believe it or not, they work pretty closely in tandem, and that's something that I do cover in the book. In fact, I was just recently reading history of the Cold War from the perspective of technology, namely Annie Jacobson's book, The Pentagon's Brain, which is a history of DARPA, and actually DARPA is a creation of the Cold War. So all through the last several decades, we've seen nothing but the ramping up of America's secret black budget, deep state programs, everything from bioweapons to MKUltra to space warfare, to use Trump's latest idea of a space force. This has been intimately tied in with Hollywood and with the entire black budget. So it's all very real. And what was needed to build this up was, in fact, the Cold War. So Russia served a very useful tool in the Cold War in terms of allowing all of these black budget projects to come into fruition and to come to reality. And then even things like the internet. The internet is really a product of the Cold War. Again, based on this fictional enemy of the evil Russians that are going to, during the first few decades, nuke us, and then it became actually biowarfare. So ironically, the Skripal affair has a precedent in the 80s and in the 90s. There was hello.
Yeah. Carry on.
I was just going to say there was a defector, Pasechnik, and others who defected from the Soviet Union, who told this story supposedly of vast archives of weapons of mass destructions that the Russians had stockpiled, and this became the basis for new initiatives of biological warfare programs in terms of U.S. defenses in the 80s and 90s.
The general consensus is that the Russians might actually be ahead of us in terms of deep state weaponry and all the rest of it. But what's this volte-face about with John Bolton meeting Putin in Tuesday, or last week, and then on Tuesday of last week, and then suddenly setting up this summit? I mean, whither the deep state, Jay? Do you know what I mean? We know that the CIA put out their propaganda through films going back all the way to the 50s and the UFO flap and all the rest of it. But Who on earth has got their hand on the tiller at the moment, and why is this sudden turnaround? Are the Russians going to be our friends again?
Well, is this what Patrick calls the magic of Trump? You don't know what to expect. You keep the. I think Trump discusses this in his book, right? Keep the opponent always guessing. You never know exactly what he's going to do, where he's going to go. There's pros and cons to that, but yeah, I think that it's going to be interesting to see if Trump actually does come through on a lot of the campaign promises that he put forward. And then maybe the first couple years, I think there's even some Trump quote like, give me a couple years and then I'll start coming through. so maybe right. He's flipping the script after he's pulled a bunch of trickery on the deep state. But I don't know, that might be too speculative. Maybe that's too positive an appraisal. But I guess Trump has been what we've expected, good and bad, kind of a mix of both.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I must admit, I think it's been mostly bad so far. Apart from the détente with Korea, really. But back to your book and your areas of speciality. I must admit, I'm ashamed to say I haven't got a copy of Esoteric Hollywood. It is a gaping hole in my library and one that needs to be filled very soon. As you know, I've got a copy of Bruce Rux's seminal work, Hollywood versus the Aliens, which talks about CIA's use of Hollywood to disseminate both information and disinformation about flying saucers, and from the 1950s onwards, and that's absolutely fascinating. I think it's out of print now, but I'd recommend that to anybody. In Esoteric Hollywood, you delve more into sort of occult symbolism in films and that kind of thing, if I'm not wrong. And you've got a second book coming up as well, Jay. So give us a wrap on your area of expertise.
Yeah, well, as I was talking about earlier, when it comes to something like the tie-in between, say, famous doctors like Robin Cook, who write science fiction stories that later become movies. This is very close to real-world drills that have been done. There was a drill, for example, in the 90s done called Dark Winter, and this was actually in the wake of the idea of Al-Qaeda gathering biological weapons from former Soviet satellite nations and then releasing them in the U.S. And this was actually reported as real for a while back in the 90s. So I know at 21st Century Wire we've covered a lot of fake news reports and drills that have supposedly gone live. And what I find fascinating is that this is not a new idea, but actually you have this precedent of scripting being done both in the sense of doctors who write fiction, Robin Cook, biowarfare attacks and so forth, and then this being not just something that's used in films that he's done, but also going live in large-scale wargaming drills. So that's kind of where I was going with the Cold War biological weapon stuff, and this again comes from a lot of defectors. Is why I was bringing that up. Is that you can't trust these defectors and the stories that are created around defectors, So I was just saying that it really echoes what was in the Skripal affair. Is these cases of defectors back in the 80s and 90s who were saying that Russia had all these plans of using WMDs on the U.S. And then what happened is that this narrative shifted away from the Russians and the RAND Corporation and different entities like that basically sold it as terror. It's not really the Russians, but now what we use the Al-Qaeda cutout and said that Al-Qaeda is using the anthrax on 9/11 and so forth. So there's a real close tie-in between fiction writers, script writers, screenplay writers, and intelligence, and this has gone on for a long time. So that's kind of what you were hinting at with the Peter Rux thing. And that's what I deal with in the book, is I look at the kinds of tie-ins between secret societies, between intelligence agents, the trafficking of secret information, and screenplay writers and film narratives, and the symbols that are used in films that actually sometimes convey what's really going on in a way that the so-called faction media doesn't do. So you actually get more truth in fiction than you do in faction.
Going all the way back, of course, to one of our favourites, James Bond.
Sure.
Although I don't know the extent to which that's still the case with Bond films. For me, Bond sort of pretty much finished in the mid '80s, and as of course they're still making them, but the original, they ran out. Certainly, long since ran out of Ian Fleming stories. I've come across stories, the idea recently that Fleming himself might have been bumped off for revealing too much in some of his books. And certainly the whole idea of Spectre, of there being effectively a third force, a hidden third force on the international global stage, which is portrayed sort of semi-comic in some of the Bond films, are sort of slightly spoofed, isn't it? But nevertheless, that idea is out there, that there's a well-organized, well-funded underworld that is able to influence both superpowers and perhaps play them off against each other. Do you know what I mean? And we've certainly seen that in the last few years, haven't we? There seems to be sort of, who is driving the anti-rational narrative? Who is causing this escalation in tension? It must be some kind of illegal third party. Sorry, I'll let you.
I think absolutely. There's a private deep state as we speak of, and this was actually, in a way, highlighted even in the newer ones, which I agree with you. They're far. They're very lacking in comparison to the actual Fleming stories, but Spectre does play a role in the recent installments of Quantum of Solace and self-titled Spectre,
right,
where we see there is an actual shadow government that's kind of in the background behind the surveillance state. So the Nine Eyes security system, which was written into the narrative, and I think the Guardian even did a piece that the screenplay writer is actually borrowing from the Snowden events. The Snowden story has been put into the Bond narrative, but there's actually some truth to this, because both in Quantum of Solace and in Spectre, you have the explicit mention of this international, not bound to any locality, not bound to any ideology, it's simply based on power. There were echoes of Bilderberg. They met in Rome. It's sort of this Club of Rome, almost Vatican-esque type entity that
right.
meets in secret, and Bond infiltrates this and discovers that, what do you know, British intelligence has been infiltrated by this. The NSA, GCHQ, they're basically run by this same third-party outlet, as you call her, the sort of fifth column, we might say. And so, yes, I think that's absolutely true. And if Trump has done anything, he's kind of brought this to the fore. He's taken the Peter Dale Scott terminology of the deep state and really brought it to the fore, whether he meant to or not. It's now kind of known that, hey, maybe this is actually how the world really works. There really is a specter with individuals like Soros and Bill Gates, and we recently saw Bilderberg meeting, and for the first time, I think the Vatican cardinal attended Bilderberg. I don't think that's
that's right. I believe so. Yeah.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a great example of, even in these subpar new ones, you have this narrative coming to the fore, which I did touch on in the book, by the way.
Yeah, no, carry on. By all means, carry on, Jay.
Oh, I was just saying I did touch on that in my book. That was a big part of the latter chapters, was the Bond sections of both old and new Bond films. I covered this topic.
To what extent as well do you think Hollywood is used by CIA security services to sort of seed future memes, for want of a better expression, to sort of start to direct the zeitgeist,
I think very heavily used. I think that's one of the key roles that Hollywood plays, and again, this even goes back to Bernays and to advertising. A lot of the people who came out of the OSS actually went into television. They went into CBS. They went into our RKO pictures. They went into, this would be people like William Sarnoff, Paley, and so the earliest people in TV were the members of the predecessor to the CIA, and I don't think it's been any different. We've seen so many people from intelligence, go into doing Hollywood, and that's precisely because it's a great way to condition people to accept things that are coming down the road. So that's what you're getting at with the memes, and that's actually touched on in my book as well. You can look at it from an esoteric perspective, and is this people who are in secret societies and they want to kind of condition people through imagery to accept some sort of bizarre religious or cultic ideology, or is it about conditioning people to accept new morals and taboos, or to accept something like consumerism? All of this stuff is an aspect to what you're getting at. I mean, if you've seen the film They Live, John Carpenter shows this in the film itself. So there's sort of a meta film analysis of the way Hollywood and film works, where everyone is conditioned to accept, for example, consumerism through Hollywood.
Yeah. No film more so, in a sense, than the conspiracy theorists' favorite, The Matrix and its sequels. Redolent with symbols and ideas of one sort or another. Of course, the fear is that Hollywood is used to, as you say, to promote the ideas of secret societies that aren't necessarily in the best interests of what we traditionally think of as middle America or liberal democracies. Okay.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I mean, there's good and bad here, certainly. The Matrix contains the idea of Plato's allegory of the cave, and there are positive aspects to the idea of what Plato was getting across. There's also some bad news in Plato, but I think that something like Eyes Wide Shut really came to the fore, which is one of the earliest chapters in the book is Eyes Wide Shut, and that's because Hollywood really operates on this kind of blackmail, sex cult type degeneracy, and I know that that's always been true of humanity, but the point is that it really came to the fore recently with the stories of Weinstein, with the stories of the NXIVM, Keith Raniere's sex cult, of the actress from the popular TV show Smallville. Here you have direct, high-level sex cults tied into the highest levels of not just Hollywood, but politics, because these are all, big-time Clinton donors. Yeah, the Weinsteins, directly tied into the Obamas. And where was any of this being discussed in the supposed liberal concerns for feminism? Right? I didn't hear Hillary being concerned for any of the women being trafficked in sex cults, but supposedly Hillary is a feminist. But what do we have here is just something that I wrote about, I think 7 or 8 years ago. Actually, I wrote the analysis of Eyes Wide Shut and talked about how there really are sex cults in Hollywood. This really is not just something that is degenerate, but it's also about blackmail. It's also about getting dirt on people. And again, this parallels things that we've seen, with the UK and with the intelligence agencies using, the different whorehouses and so forth to get dirt. And so Hollywood's basically no different. I think John Cusack was correct when he said Hollywood's basically a giant whorehouse.
Right. Yeah, we've even got a new TV series, actually. We talk about the terminology of Peter Dale Scott coming into the mainstream. Epix has a new thriller called Deep State.
Oh, wow.
With Mark Strong playing a former MI6 agent called Max Easton, who might have assassinated a few people in the line of duty. That's sort of glossed over, So we're getting a bleed through, aren't we, from realpolitik into Hollywood and back again,
Yeah, that symbiotic relationship is kind of what I wanted to focus on in the book, and that's a big part of it. Is how it kind of feeds back and forth. And actually, other scholars have talked about this. you and I have talked about Bond in the past, and one of the Bondologists who's well known is Umberto Eco, the famous Italian semantician. And it's actually Eco that made that point. He talked about the fact that there's always this strange symbiotic relationship between very powerful, iconic pulp fiction and pop culture and driving the public consciousness. And this is something that most people aren't aware of, but it has a tremendous power. It's unbelievable, the power in these fictional stories to drive people's the mass consciousness's perception. And I thought that's why I needed to write this book, was because it's such a powerful tool for the Hollywood magicians to use and to bamboozle us.
For the making of modern myths. I mean, it's surprising in some ways that we haven't had more Hollywood films about 9/11 to reinforce that particular myth.
That's a good point. That's a great point. Yeah. You would think there would be, exactly. And I think the 21 Wire has done a great job over the last 5 or 6 years of really pointing out how many big Hollywood blockbusters were nothing more than glorified war propaganda. That's also something I highlighted in the book, and relied on quite a bit of 21 Wire articles. So yeah, I think that once 9/11 served its purpose initially, which, as I was pointing out a minute ago, directly comes out of fictional narratives. There were many fictional narratives that were written prior to 9/11 that included a lot of those same ideas. One of which is Dark Winter, although the war game Dark Winter didn't involve crashing jets into the towers. There were plenty of drills prior to 9/11 that did. So you have all these fictional scenarios that are written up, and then somebody says, well, that would actually be a good idea for a book. Why don't I take one of these drills that have been written up, put this into some garbage Pulp Fiction, and then it gets made into a movie, and that's just the way it goes. So
wasn't it the Medusa project that had planes flying into skyscrapers?
Yeah, that's a good point. There were a lot of different scenarios. I think one of the drills was Vigilant Guardian. There were fictional stories prior to 9/11, like the Lone Gunman episode, which most people are probably familiar with by now, where you have hijacked jets being flown into the towers and so forth. There were even cartoons that included scenarios of both the Pentagon and the Twin Towers being hit by amorphous terror organizations, and this is from the 1994 Iron Man cartoon. Now, some people thought that I was really stretching by pointing that out, but if you look at who wrote that cartoon, it was the same guy who worked with the Pentagon on crafting G.I. Joe, namely, I think his name is Friedman. So when you look at the cartoons that a character like Friedman has done, who works intimately with both big corporate interests and the Pentagon and the Army, it's not hard to believe that you could have a direct relationship between, once again, not just big Hollywood films, but even kids' stories. Even kids' stories, children's programming includes these same ideas. G.I. Joe is very famous for this in the U.S., if you're not familiar with it in the U.K., but it's a cartoon that ran in the 80s that everybody from my generation grew up with, and it included a host of pretty astounding levels of propaganda for its time.
Right. Yeah, I think children's programs is a whole separate area, really, isn't it? Because, of course, it's priming the next generation with ideas. Children often watch a lot of television on their own. The parents aren't necessarily aware of the ideology that's being promoted.
Right. Yeah, and certainly, G.I. Joe, for example, was a recruitment propaganda operation appropriate for children growing up in the 80s. Join the special forces team, you'll fight the terrorists. And what do we have was Cobra, the international terrorist organization, already being prepped then. Right. But I think what's most astounding is that G.I. Joe had episodes about the Federal Reserve. It had episodes about fiat currency explicitly being mentioned. It had episodes about HARP style technology. It had episodes about MK Ultra, mind control, intelligence agencies using mind control.
Are you kidding, Jay?
And I'm absolutely 100% certain. I actually went back and watched the entire series.
Mind control for kids.
Yeah, and I thought, well, who is writing this? So that's when I looked into researching Friedman and his works, and he was actually the guy that wrote and created Transformers and G.I. Joe. And then you look into his background and his work with the Pentagon, and it was really astounding. It was like, this is not coincidence that this guy is working with the Army, with the Pentagon, and he's crafting these TV shows for children.
Yeah, I mean, so many films going, right the way back to the immediate post-war era are generally sort of favorable towards militarism, if not directly, recruitment films almost, We had a brief spate after Vietnam, things like The Deer Hunter Coming Home, about the awfulness of war, the Vietnam War in particular. But since then, I think there's been a return to more sort of machismo ideas of war and how, war is necessary to defeat the bad guys. Do you know what I mean? So there's a brief window of sort of very sensitive films about the human suffering caused on both sides by war. That era was quite short-lived at the end of the 1970s. And since then, as I say, we've had much more sort of, I don't watch them, but there's been a sort of tendency towards sort of more jingoistic type, heavy on action, pro-military films,
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Vietnam. In the book that I was just finishing up, the Pentagon's Brain book, she actually has 2 chapters on Vietnam, and she talks about the black operations that were done there. Now, I want to stress this is not a conspiracy book. It's actually a very mainline Pulitzer-nominated journalistic work. So this is not somebody who's coming at this from a conspiracy vantage point. She doesn't have any interest in conspiracies. But she has in her chapters on Vietnam discussions of the fact that I don't know what your personal views of geoengineering is, but she makes it very clear that the Rand Corporation, the CIA, and DARPA were already doing atmospheric geoengineering in Vietnam. Vietnam was actually a test bed for doing that. So Agent Orange wasn't just experimenting with bioweapons; it was actually an atmospheric defloration experiment. She argues, wherein they were trying to modify the climate to supposedly defeat the Viet Cong. Of course, what we find out is that later down the road, this was really just a big laboratory experiment to see how far they could modify the climate, how far they could relocate populations. They had Rand had a whole population resettlement program in Vietnam. So that's the sad thing, is that I'm watching. It reminded me of watching Apocalypse Now recently, and Colonel Kurtz is basically a representation of the madness of war. He's supposedly this bad guy, but then you come to realize at the end that his insanity is really just a representation of war itself. It's insanity to do this stuff for the gain of just a couple very wealthy people and stockholders for defense contractors.
Right. Yeah, and that insanity of war is a message that seems to be lost.
Yes, Hollywood doesn't do this anymore.
Sorry, go on, Jay.
I'm sorry. Hollywood doesn't do this anymore. I wanted to agree with your point that this is not really done anymore. You don't have Oliver Stone style critiques of war film.
No,
really, you just have these Black Hawk Down style militaristic, sniper, American snipers style stuff.
Yeah, one of my favorites is a film called Men in War, made by Anthony Mann in the 1950s, and starring a genuine liberal anti-war activist in Robert Ryan, and that's a deeply psychological effect about the mental trauma that war inflicts on men. The commanding officer is mute as a result of the traumas that he's experienced. They're trying to get their colonel back safely behind their own lines, and what he's seen has meant that he's unable. He's gone completely mute. He's in a state of shock, basically, unable to say a single word. And it's an absolutely fascinating film. We know that countless thousands of American soldiers have been traumatized by their experiences in Iraq. Record levels of suicide amongst veterans. This is all kept very quiet. We do not have any films exploring the psychological damage done to veterans of the Iraq War, let alone the damage done to the indigenous populations and the societies destroyed. It's very much a case of let's move on to the next thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very sad. That also fits into the recent book I was doing, and the book that I just finished, my second book, where you have the beginnings in the Iraq War, Gulf War, and then Iraq War, Part 1, Desert Storm, Part 1 and 2. The sequel, which actually has a kind of Hollywood broadcast by CNN style mode to it. I know that Vietnam was the first war to technically be broadcast, but believe it or not, they were actually experimenting with Hollywood-style broadcasting of wars via CNN with the Gulf War and Desert Storm and so forth. And what was interesting about Iraq is that that's where not just U.S. soldiers were severely traumatized with PTSD, but it's where they began the experimentation of microchipping soldiers and using bioenhancement on the battlefield. And in fact, I just was reading a section of Norman Schwarzkopf's diary where he said, or his account of it, and he says, this is when we began actually to implement video games into warfare. And he says that we watched a simulation of everything that could happen in one of these sort of simulant world systems that plays out wargaming ahead of time. He said, and then when we actually went into the battle in Iraq, he says it played out almost exactly like our simulation predicted. He said, I was amazed because he said I was living out a video game. And I got to thinking how absurd and how dystopic that here you have General Schwarzkopf saying that we basically played this out in a video game, and then I went and acted out the video game.
Yeah. And that's particularly the case with this drone warfare, isn't it? Where
yes, exactly.
I think people are operating from a base in somewhere in rural Kansas, but it ain't like no episode of Bilko. Do you know what I mean?
Right, and Vietnam was where Rand and the CIA and DARPA began experimenting with the drone warfare. Some of the bioweapon Agent Orange modification was done through early drones. This eventually became modified into more of an AI style system that keys into satellites.
I've lost you there, I think, Jay. You broke up a bit. I just want to check with our producer Hesha that
something like that.
Okay, mate. Sorry, you'll have to repeat that. We just lost you there briefly. You broke up a little bit.
Apologies. I was just saying that one of the more dystopic aspects that I did cover in the second book was the Terminator series and the tie-ins to Terminator series with the Reagan era hatched that Bohemian Grove idea of the Star Wars Defense Initiative, which is the idea of basically tying the drones into a Skynet kind of AI system.
Right.
And you're absolutely right that was really that's the way it's done now. I think the Air Force had a document decades ago saying that by 2020, the goal would be to have essentially an entirely drone Air Force.
It's a scary thought. And, the 80s were an interesting time in terms of, pointing the way forward to the decades that we are now about to enter. It's only couple of years, or we'll be in the 2020s, you know. We'll be in the time that Blade Runner and Terminator and RoboCop all spoke about. And the automated, either sort of transhuman or fully robotic soldier who will execute you as a result of facial recognition technology or something, isn't all that far away either, is it?
Yeah, that's I think one of the more poignant chapters in the book was my Blade Runner chapter, and there was so much prescience in Philip K. Dick's story and in Ridley Scott's version that it's almost hard to break down because it operates on multiple levels. I mean, you've got basically this alchemical transhumanism going on. You've got, you know, even down to the level of Sexbots being predicted, which we're now seeing rolled out on a massive scale.
Yeah. In fact, Sexbots now who will say no as well. I saw this.
I saw that.
Sorry.
Well, you've got to feel bad if you had to resort to a Sexbot and then she turns it down. That's kind of like
I was going to say,
the ultimate. You know.
The ultimate brush off, isn't it? Except they're watching TV with a sex robot in the other chair who doesn't want to do it with you, honestly. But,
and you move your hand over to her lap, and she basically disintegrates you with her death laser beam.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, who's in charge of Hollywood at the moment, do you think, Jay? You know, who's running the show? Have the Weinstein scandals rocked the boat to any extent, you know?
I think there was fairly success. I mean, I don't know exactly what this latest update is on his trial. I know he's supposed to go to court. I don't know what's going to come of that, but I don't think this is going to affect any big-scale change in Hollywood, although it does seem to damage the traditional ideas of Hollywood. So, you know, we're transitioning over into Netflix and streaming. That's the future. It's not going to be, you know, movie theaters. A lot of the big studios are supposedly being sold off to China. So, you know, perhaps the Zionist interests don't really care about Hollywood anymore. They can move on now just to sell it off to China. I don't know exactly what their plan is, but I mean, Netflix is going to continue to function as an arm of propaganda of the ruling Western regime. If you notice, the Obamas now have a $40 million contract to produce Netflix content, which is
I did see that. I suppose that's the kind of offer you get when you're an ex-president of the United States, you know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the direct. I mean, even with Trump, right? I mean, we have somebody from reality TV who becomes president. So
that's right. And the next one could be Oprah Winfrey.
Oprah, exactly.
That's the. You know, you can start buying into this. You know, there's a promotional material for Oprah 2020. I mean, there's no doubt that Trump opened the door in that respect.
Yeah.
I'll find us some odds on a price on Oprah Winfrey being elected the next president of the United States of America. But I mean, it's the subject of a Hollywood film, really, isn't it? Two reality TV stars against Trump v. Winfrey, you know, 2020. That's that's a movie right there, isn't it? But do you think the delivery platforms are going to cause the long-awaited democratization of cinema in a way that iTunes has democratized music to some extent? Or do you think the powers that be are going to continue to serve up the content that they want us to have? You know, in other words, a lot of people are predicting the closure of even the multi-screen cinemas are sort of increasingly irrelevant. People watching films on laptops, tablets, phones, you know, but not necessarily going to the cinema. So surely there will come a point where wider variety of producers are able to present their material, and we don't have to have this. We don't have to have this deep state-driven narrative. For want of a better way of putting it.
Well, that's certainly a possibility. Of course, then we have to worry with Google basically altering their algorithms to where your material, your artwork, your presentation is buried under an infinity of searches. So there's that aspect to it, and then simultaneously the shadow banning on the part of the social media if your content is not stamped with deep state approval. For example, movies that promote this is the recent Purge film, which I'm not recommending, but it's a dystopian story where there's an allowance basically of no laws for I think a day every year. This is a dystopian future where the laws are suspended and you can basically do anything you want for a day. The previous two narratives have included quite a bit of racial tension hype, and intentionally, obviously. They've included a Hillary-type president, and this latest installment has Russian Orthodox terrorists basically running around. So in the future, when the dystopia comes, you're going to be worried about Russian terrorists running around everywhere in America. So what I'm getting at is that is going to continue to be promoted by the big streaming sites, which are taking over for the studios. But I think that, yes, ultimately there will be a lot more of a market for individuals. Patreon, Kickstarter, these kinds of things are opening up venues for people to create independent content that's much better than the kind of watered down stuff from the establishment. But then there's the aspect, as we said, of your stuff being shadow banned. So there's always a way to you have to constantly deal with this sort of trickery.
22 to 1, Oprah Winfrey to become the next president of the United States. With Betfair and Paddy Power, that's the best price you can get. But she's as short as 12 to 1 with William Hill. Actually, sorry, that's to become the Democratic candidate, not to become president. But 22 to 1, she's a Democratic candidate, between 12 and 22, which is a relatively short price. It's not she's not a 250 to 1 no-hoper.
What were the Trump odds at this stage last time?
About the same. Certainly. Really? Okay. Possibly bigger. Bigger. Nobody took him seriously until quite late on in the proceedings. Right.
Do you think they'll run Bernie?
I don't know. Well, they rigged it against him last time. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't rig it against him again. So the Democratic National Committee shows no signs of embracing change. In fact, they've recently come out as being every bit as pro-war and pro-fracking.
Yeah, and, saw that. Yeah.
As anything else. So I'm not optimistic on that particular score. And of course, this time round as well, you may or may not have noticed huge numbers of ex-CIA, National Security Agency, etc. staff running as Democrat candidates this midterm elections.
Mm-hmm.
They're all coming out of the woodwork and want to make the transition from deep state apparatchik to public official.
Well, I did a long analysis of the Black Mirror series, and one of those episodes included the idea of a comedic AI simulation becoming president or UK Prime Minister, I believe. So why don't we just go ahead and skip past this stuff and just go for the ultimate absurdity, and let's just have like an AI Pokemon run for president or something. Which, I mean, that series included quite a bit of predictive programming, I guess you could say, with the first episode, having the story of the UK minister having to have relations with a pig, and then I think 2 or 3 years later, the story of David Cameron comes out. So perhaps Charlie Brooker knew. I think we talked about that in the past, but the later episodes in the show, which I don't think, I think the show kind of went downhill. when it got to Netflix, but there was quite a bit of this sort of dystopic prediction going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other sort of standout bits of predictive programming that you noticed from Hollywood in the last year or two from your research, Jay? What would you say? Is it the transgender agenda, the transhumanism agenda? What do you think they're trying to push particularly at the moment?
I would say the transgender has really ratcheted up to level 9,000, Tranny 9,000, basically, which sounds like a bad movie. But I think that's really the latest in the social engineering aspect of it. Hollywood is great at changing people's morals and giving us bad morals. And I think that you're absolutely right that the trans agenda, I never would have expected that to be so in everyone's face, 5-6 years ago even. Yeah. But I think after Bruce Jenner being, given Woman of the Year award, that Hollywood just went crazy with this, and that's really what you're seeing in a lot of these streaming shows now is sympathy for the trans character, trans-based shows, and I think it's only a matter of time before, Disney gives us a trans princess for the children. So,
right. Yes, I can see that. I watched a clip this morning about an individual chap called Ken Walt who had sort of gender issues, but nevertheless got married, had a couple of children, and then at 44 went to see somebody who recommended gender reassignment, which he underwent, including hormones and surgery. And 8 years odd after having become a woman, he decided to become a man again. Although, of course, unfortunately, I don't think you're able to get your testicles back. But the point being that he said he did a lot of research, very serious subject really. He did a lot of research into psychology and discovered that he had confused gender dysphoria with other aspects of obsessional behavior. All right. In other words, his gender dysphoria wasn't really to do with gender, but was to do with other psychological, psychiatric conditions that he had.
Yes,
he'd been working through. So the rush to surgery and gender reassignment is, particularly when it comes to children, is something that I think is actually potentially extremely damaging and dangerous, particularly since we're now coming across people saying they don't want to assign a gender to their child at birth. I mean, what? Soon we'll be calling dogs cats and cats dogs, and saying we don't want to label this cat with the cat title. We're gonna treat it as a dog. We want the cat to decide, does it want to be a cat or a dog? It's as absurd as that, isn't it, Jay?
It is, and I think you're onto something with that diagnosis. I read a book by Dr. Colin Ross, who deals with people with dissociative identity disorder, and many of whom are people who believe that they want to have gender reassignment. And essentially what he does is work with them on the very point that you made. He says, could there perhaps be other psychological problems that you are dealing with that lead you to believe that changing your gender is what's going to solve these problems? And I think he claims at least to have had quite a bit of success with people, in that regard. So if you read his book, Osiris Complex, that's essentially what he says.
And the other thing, the taboo aspect of this whole subject to some extent, is the possibility of multi-dimensional interference. In other words, that the physical body may be time-sharing. Somebody may be time-sharing their physical body with essentially another entity, with a non-physical entity, a form of possession, if you like, who has a different agenda for that person's physical body, which isn't necessarily in their best interests. What people used to call possession of one sort or another.
I would say that's true. Yeah.
So but that's a completely sort of taboo analysis amongst the.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So, well, this has been great, Jay. We've got to wind our way back to the deep state in order to get Patrick and George Carlin in. As George famously said about the, in inverted commas, powers that be, it's a big club and you ain't in it.
I'd say that sums it up, yeah.
And it's 10 years since he passed away. So we're going to take a short break. Thanks, Jay. Do join us again after the break when we're going to be, Patrick's going to be joining us. And we've got our George Carlin special, his rap to the press club from not long before he died, I believe, 10 years ago, since the great man left us. And who is there to